Yeah, I'm Tomoki Fukui, pronouns are they, them. I'm calling in today from New York City, which is otherwise known as Lenape. Um, so right now I'm on like indigenous land that is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape. And I I don't know. I want us to, I guess, as we're talking, kind of be mindful of the kind of ongoing nature of Indigenous sovereignty and how much I think our conversations today, especially about like nuclear colonialism and nuclear imperialism, are really indebted to Indigenous analyses of the nuclear age. Um, yeah, so I think I'm just gonna keep it brief there.
Thank you. Um, I'm Norma Field, and I'm calling in from Chicago, in the South Side, because I worked for many years at the University of Chicago, which was a major, major site of the Manhattan Project. In fact, it's where Fermi's uh, world famous experiment took place. I was looking for land acknowledgements that might have been formulated by members of the University of Chicago community. And I was particularly eager to do this because land acknowledgements, there's a trend now at the university here to discourage land acknowledgements on the principle that something called the Calvin Report, which was drawn up in the 1960s, which also was a tumultuous time for this campus. The Calvin Report was drawn up there, and it stresses the importance of institutional neutrality. The institution staying neutral means that individual members of it are have full access to free speech. And I think it's very hard to know if you're a teacher or a student where you become independent from the institution if you're speaking as someone who's part of it and on the land. So I found one written by someone, a student, back in 2021 who was a candidate for 2024. So I hope this person will be graduating this June by Symphony Fletcher at the Pritzker School of Medicine. And this was written for the University of Chicago, Juneteenth, 2021, Juneteenth being June 19th, increasingly recognized around this country as this celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation and the freeing of slaves. So let me start. The land on which we gather, inhabit, work, and live is the original homelands and traditional territory of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, and the Oceti-Sakowin. These lands were the home of these native nations prior to their forced removal and relocation. These lands continue to be embedded with the rich histories and struggles for survival of each nation. UChicago does not exist independently from centuries of forced labor and economic extraction from enslaved African Americans. In 1857, Stephen A. Douglas, the famous Douglas of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, donated 10 acres of land, valued today at approximately $1.2 million, for the initial construction of the University of Chicago. Though most of history remembers Douglas for his political career, the humans that he owned and amassed his fortune from have a starkly different recollection. So I think this gets at many of the issues we want to keep in mind as we proceed with our discussion today. So that's where I'll stop now. And then maybe Tommy can introduce themselves more fully to us.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Norma, for that really lovely acknowledgement from where you are. Um, so yeah, like I said, I'm Tomoki Fukui. I usually go by Tommy. I am an anthropologist who has been researching the TEPCO Fukushima nuclear disaster, and just recently completed my dissertation on the topic. Now I'm working at the CUNY, City University of New York, within that educational system. I work at John Jay College, which is College for Criminal Justice, um, uh, which is, anyways, an interesting experience for me, just being who I am. Kind of, yeah. Um, yeah. And I'm trying to think, yeah, I don't know. I'm just like very happy to be here today with you. Um, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Um, we met a few years after the Fukushima disaster began. And
Yeah.
beginning reminds me to say that sometimes, I mean, sometimes it depends on how far back we go, but it's much easier to pinpoint the beginning of a nuclear disaster because there's no end.
Mm.
So at the time, you were a grad student and you were embarked on field work in Fukushima.
Mhm.
And I was launched into my retirement from the University of Chicago.
Mhm.
And what else? For me, Fukushima was something that drew together important points in my life, in my history, as well as the things I've cared about in my 30 odd years of teaching at the University of Chicago. And I was just thinking that one of my earliest memories from like 3 or 4 is listening to my American father who came to Japan with the US occupation at the end of World War II, and my mother, a Japanese woman, whom he married. And one of my earliest memories of a scene is my parents arguing about the justice, the legitimacy of dropping of US nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific. And we're coming up very close to March 1st, Bikini Day, many Japanese know it as, or Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day. So that's one memory signpost for me. And the
Mm.
next one comes around 10 when my family first got a television and seeing some of the very earliest footage made available in Japan of the A-bombs. And this was of the term we tend to use is vaporized, though I've subsequently learned it's not technically correct, but of a figure seated, excuse me, on stone steps, granite steps, and then just his shadow, her, not completely sure, but seems likely to be a he. And seeing that image when I was 10 was so powerful. And I thought, what are grown-ups doing if we're living with something this deadly? Why don't people stop worrying about what to eat for dinner or, homework or things like that and do everything they possibly can to make sure it's never used again?
Mm.
And in some ways, I was thinking that this order, the reverse order of encountering the bombs from 1945 and discussion about American US testing in the Pacific from 1954 onwards, afterward, in reverse order, probably is the way many Japanese learned who were not in Hiroshima and Nagasaki about the bombs because of censorship during the occupation. And so it's learning about Pacific testing and particularly about the tuna vessels. That's the initial impetus. It's like
Mm.
seeing what an A-bomb can do to, in this case, other people. So that the interest and availability of knowledge about Marshall Islanders comes later, but it certainly comes. So that's, in a way, how I came to always have nuclear worries in the back of my mind, and Fukushima coalesces all that.
Mm.
Um, and I think it's, yes, the Manhattan Project is remembered a lot, mostly as a Fermi sculpture by Henry Moore. And a lot of energy goes into um, maintaining the difference between atoms for war and atoms for peace. And so I think I'll stop there. And maybe, Tommy, you can kick us off into what we want to share with
Oh,
people
yeah.
today.
Sure. Yeah. I'm trying to think. I guess before I wanted to come back to the point of, I guess, our encounter in Fukushima and how we started out. Um, I guess I think one of the connecting pieces that I feel like kind of drew us together, I was trying to think about what it is about um, how you move through the world as a scholar, but also as a person that kind of I don't know that kind of puts us in conversation. And I just wanted to kind of frame like the rest of our conversation in those terms. So I don't know if this is right, but I felt like there's this kind of feminist like love that is really animating like the spaces that we're both trying to be part of and the work that we're trying to uphold or uplift. Um, so I was thinking about that. And then I guess in terms of like our memories of nuclear things are so different. Because I think the generational differences are really big, and also like our respective relationships to Japan, are also kind of really big factors there. I guess for me, I kind of was caught up in like a whirlwind identity crisis about my relationship to Japan and trying to kind of think about um, like family histories or intergenerational histories of motherhood and illness, and was trying to make sense of being trans, or like I identify as a gender flex, which is kind of within the umbrella of non-binary gender identities. But I kind of, I felt like a kite with like these tenuous ties to Japan. And then to kind of come to understand myself as trans on top of that was like cutting the strings of the kite. And there was kind of no more possibility of redemption within the context of a patriarchal family where you've already been figured as lacking in some way because of these histories of gender and illness. Um, so when I kind of went to Fukushima, I was kind of drawn into wanting to be of service to mothers who were marked as unfit by the Japanese nation state in some way or by their families in some way. And so I just kind of wanted to name that as like my entry point, which is like, I don't know, it's like different. It's such a, I don't know, sometimes feels like such a different location within this like landscape of nuclear things. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everything you just said. Yeah, because it's so important. If I'm totally honest, when I learned a little bit about you and knew that you were facing writing a dissertation, this pain settled in my stomach, thinking about how you relate to Fukushima and just what you said, for example, about mothers, um, and thinking about the protocol for dissertation writing, in the academy generally and in anthropology. And I thought, oh, this is a really, really serious challenge. And how is Tommy going to hang on to these really precious ways of connecting to Fukushima
Mm.
while writing something called a dissertation? And having read it, I know you did it. And I think that in itself is a brave and beautiful and almost miraculous act.
Mm.
So I want to say that. And I also want to say that it's seeing what you just said about being interested, being drawn to, wanting to help mothers placed in a dubious light socially for protesting irradiation of themselves, their children, their families, of their land, their homes. That clarified for me why I was drawn to the people I was drawn to when I started visiting Fukushima. I've never lived in Fukushima the way Tommy has, so that's also a really big difference. But I am so grateful to know that my instincts about who I cherished and who become my teachers
Mm,
and mentors and some of the dearest friends of my life.
mm,
Uh, I
mm,
have to say thanks to the nuclear disaster, because otherwise I would never have met them.
mm,
That clarification I really gained from watching you.
mm, mm. Thank you.
It's great.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the point of I know the anthropologist Ryo Morimoto talks about Eng, like the Eng of the nuclear disaster, which which is also something people say a lot in Fukushima, like Eng, it for those, people who are not um kind of familiar with Japanese social cultural context, is kind of like the idea that there are these seemingly chance encounters that if you kind of pay attention to them and I guess have faith that they have meaning, that they kind of develop into really meaningful connections with each other. I don't know if that feels right to you. Yeah, okay. Um, but I was also trying to think about like what's the end between kind of women who have been impacted by fallout and then like trans people who are often kind of really made invisible or kind of treated as these like strange interlopers in social spaces. So I was thinking about that in terms of like, I think I feel like what we want to talk about and how we want to remember, not I mean not necessarily remember the beginning of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, but also like witness its present as something that's still ongoing. Like I think the way that we want to do that seems very connected to trying to build more of a space um where like women impacted by fallout and like these kind of usually ghostly kind of trans presences can exist fully in the same
Mhm.
space, which to me feels like very connected to trying to build cultures of life or trying to build accountable relationships or going on these journeys of like really deep feeling. So I was trying to think of like keywords, and like one thing that came to mind was this idea of bodily sovereignty and like the importance of our spiritual lives, and seeing that as like very connected to like um, this kind of witnessing that you do. Um, so anyways, so those are some things that came to mind when I was trying to think about like what is the like what's the opening frame for me if I were to put it into words, like how would I say it? Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With that um I guess we should start. I guess so we've thought of this as maybe kind of a series of meditations on images and very short video clips that I think to us kind of were resonant in one way or another, in how we see the ongoing present of the nuclear disaster.
Well, we can
Yeah.
just remind ourselves and everyone that there was a very, very serious earthquake on a peninsula on the continent side, facing side of Japan on New Year's Day, which is not a good harbinger for the new year. And that because of Fukushima, the sited nuclear power plant had not been operating, which was a good thing. But there was also a nuclear power plant that had been resisted further up in the peninsula. And had that actually worked, had that been built, it would have been right under major fault movement. And so it was, as one seismologist, a very senior seismologist, saying, we should be so grateful for these warnings that nature has given us. We didn't pay enough attention even after Fukushima. Now, are we going to pay attention to the Noto earthquake? And the mayor of a town says that who he had run on a pro-nuclear platform, like, hurry up, let's do nuclear restarts because there's that war in Ukraine, we need energy, and plus nuclear power is good for climate change and global warming because it doesn't require fossil fuels, which we know it's true only in that brief part of its cycle that depends on fissioning and the heat generated by it. So, but 8 days later, he confronts this earthquake. And he suddenly, as an elected politician, is extremely rare. He says, what did we think we were doing? There's no place to escape because the roads have undergone, what is it called? Liquefaction. And the harbors have moved up and down, so as much as 4 meters in one place. So there's no way we can escape by sea or by land into the air. And all the drills we had done, evacuation drills, were drills just for the sake of drilling and had nothing to do with reality. So that was a very powerful statement by a politician, as I said, extremely unusual. I don't think it's being heeded very much by the powers that be, but it's important to, I think the nuclear generation of electricity is too dangerous to have anywhere, but to have it all over a seismologically active archipelago is the height of folly. And not just folly, but criminality, I think, in terms of the damage it has and can do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, this kind of actually segues into what I was thinking of talking about with the wastewater dumping issue, which is that the impacts or the full effects of that, the same way as climate change, are so unequally distributed. Like Notohanto, I mean, it was completely cut off and there was no way for the aid to reach anyone there, like by land or by sea, or there was just like no way to even kind of help people who needed immediate assistance. And to me that seems, I mean, connected to the geography of that peninsula, but also like it seems that there's like a history of underdevelopment in that region as well that like really impacts like which infrastructures, like who infrastructure is built for and who it's meant to exclude. Yeah, and with I don't know, with the nuclear disaster, it's the same thing where you've already calculated out like these are the people that we can accept kind of sacrificing, and the disaster is just what makes that manifest. But it's already been kind of in the planning from the beginning. Yeah, I think one thing to think about with the nuclear disaster is that like the harms from it, I think, I mean, it was a global scale disaster. The fallout kind of went all across the world in the same way that it did in the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and with all the nuclear weapons testing fallout. And there are maps kind of mapping kind of all of the radiation, the fallout, I don't know, that kind of went through the ocean plumes. But I think recently one of the things that happened this past year was TEPCO and the government of Japan were finally able to push through their plans to start dumping what they call treated radioactive waste. They like to call treated water It's radioactive wastewater that's been in contact with the melted through fuel, so it contains like tons of radionuclides, and has like the Pacific Island Forum hired an independent panel to kind of look at um, to actually review the process that they were using for assessing whether the wastewater had indeed been kind of successfully treated, or whether kind of all of the radionuclides involved had been successfully removed, and basically just found that it was like scientifically not providing any kind of meaningful data. Um, but the, let's see, but I was thinking about how, let's see, Pacific Islander kind of resistance to the plans to kind of dump this treated water, or this wastewater, into the Pacific Ocean have really kind of highlighted these geographies of nuclear imperialism and colonialism that kind of come to the fore when we think about it. And for me, like the timing, so this happened in August of 2023, which is the same month that in Japan we would kind of commemorate the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So to me, it really highlighted how like the Pacific has already been so impacted by, you know, nuclear imperialism and colonialism. And here is just another event that kind of keeps repeating that history, or that keeps kind of repeating that process as an ongoing thing.
Do you want to share, for example, the Young Solwara?
Yeah,
Um, it's such a beautiful and evocative site.
yeah. Let's see. So yeah, this is the website for Young Salvada Pacific. Um, they're a Pacific Islander youth organization who have been kind of framing this issue of the Japan's kind of dumping of radioactive wastewater in the context of nuclear justice in the Pacific. Um, and I thought it was really moving how they kind of center considerations of like about future generations, about environmental health, and then about this concept of transboundary harm, which is basically a harm against the kind of sovereignty of a people. Um, and I like that they have kind of memory kind of front and center at their website. Like they talk about remembering nuclear stories from a Mahi perspective. I think this is for an event that is upcoming. Um, but it really kind of, for me, emphasizes that kind of centering this care for future generations and the environment, and for Indigenous sovereignty really requires collective memory, um, and remembering that the ignorance about environmental health and radiation is directly linked to ignorance about colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. So it's like the fact that, yeah, it, I think there's a lot of questions about like who can afford to not know or not be aware of both of these things together. Um, So I don't know. One thing I was thinking about is like the problems of the lifespan studies with atomic bomb survivors, or were not created by like a race neutral, faceless, kind of ahistorical system. They came right out of American imperialism, and they keep getting repeated, you know, now in Fukushima, you know, in the Marshall Islands, and in so many other places that have been impacted by radioactive fallout, or by weapons testing and uranium production and all of that. Um, and I thought, I don't know, there was a chant that people were saying. There was a protest against the dumping of the wastewater, like the start of that, in August in Suva, which is the capital of Fiji. And people were chanting like, "We are a people. Um, this is our ocean," you know? And I thought that just that chant even is such a, like the assertion of kind of like we are a people and there is a, we require political accountability. I thought was a really powerful.
We are
Yeah.
a people and not garbage, and we're not available to be your experimental subjects.
Yeah.
That's not why we came on this earth.
Yeah.
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 I found this so this website and everything you've said so important and resonant in many ways. Um, Partly what you were saying about the Hiroshima Nagasaki studies, which have created the standards,
Yeah.
the lifespan studies, which are often called the gold standard, even though they ignore incorporated internalized radioactivity.
Mhm.
And that has been so powerful and absolutely useful and essential to denying acknowledgement and compensation and care
Mhm.
to impacted people around the world, including in Japan.
Mhm.
And so I just wanted to also say that Japan was an imperial power through World War II, and that in many ways it's taken up the mantle, the governments, successive governments have taken up the mantle, yeah, the framing provided by the US. And I think dumping the wastewater is part of that. But
Mhm.
looking at that and seeing that French Polynesia comes up very high, um, this is a personal piece of knowledge, but it's historical too, in the sense that I think many people don't know. In 1995, when Jacques Chirac resumed nuclear testing in French Polynesia, my daughter happened to be a college student, was in Japan, and she was asked by friends she had met to come and interpret for two representatives from French Polynesia who were speaking to a Japanese audience. And this is the part that's amazing to me, is 2,000 people packed a hall, I think on a Sunday, to hear
Mhm.
these people speak. And so there was that in 1995, there was that susceptibility, readiness to take on, to try to call attention to, excuse me, and to help to protest also the harm being done to French Polynesians,
Mhm.
um, by another colonial imperial power.
Mhm.
And so, yes, on the one hand, the Japanese government has been extremely determined and mostly effective in trying to deny the harms, but there has been resistance, much more of it than we might be likely to remember, and going back
Yeah.
further.
Yeah.
So I want to underscore that, and maybe also say, by the way, that there have been more sightings of nuclear power plants that have been successfully refused than have actually happened. And so, which is another reason we have these big clusters of reactors in one place, dangerously close together, because it's too much of a pain to persuade people where they're not happy to host a nuclear reactor. So
Mhm.
I do want to remind us of a strong threat of resistance
Mhm.
in Japan, both people for themselves and for others.
Mhm. Yeah.
This is a excuse me, video clip I found on the site of Our Planet TV, which is an independent news organization that has been extremely steadfast on, well, LGBTQ issues, the nuclear issue, and several Okinawa, many things that come together for us. And this is a video they put up. It was taken, it sounds, at noon at 12:30 on the day, August 24th, 2023, when TEPCO had announced that the discharge would begin. And the person taking the video is a grandmother of a young thyroid cancer patient. And she tells us that she supposed it was going to happen, but she couldn't believe it in the sense that seeing a young person already struggling with a cancer diagnosis so early in life, isn't that enough harm done? I can't believe you're now going to spread it through the oceans. That's how um I read her saying they're not really going to do it, but they are. So she went to the sea, the coast, driving about an hour, I think, each way, and said, I knew that I wasn't going to see anything, right? That's the way radioactivity works. I wasn't going to see any difference, but I had to go there and see it with my own eyes. So I think it's good to also hear the sound of the water and see her panorama of that beautiful seascape. You visited that coast, that part of the coast?
Yeah, I did. I think when you're there, I mean, at least this is just me, maybe just me, but um, you feel the presence of the radioactive fallout as well as the kind of um, tsunami victims, I think, a lot when you're driving along there or when you're spending time there. I felt very unsettled, I guess, whenever I was on the coast by the waves. I remembered there was like I can't remember if it was on NHK or somewhere else. There was an interview with people in Miyagi Prefecture, which is just north of Fukushima, who were, you know, very impacted by the tsunami. And like they talked about this feeling of being unsettled when they were kind of basically some people had no option but kind of to return to their homes. And it was like the ocean had just become this really disturbing presence. Um, and yeah, I don't know. So that comes to mind for me when I look at that video. Um, the other thing that I think about is the kind of intergenerational unity or care that it shows because of, like you had mentioned, that this was a grandmother who, you know, has a grandchild with thyroid cancer. Um, and there's sometimes a narrative of kind of intergenerational fracturing because of the nuclear disaster, and that the elderly people want to return and the young people want to leave. But this to me kind of showed a real like, um, I don't know, just there are all these ways that people are feeling about the nuclear disaster that they're not necessarily publicly expressing. That I think diverge so much from the like oversaturation of images when you're in the prefecture. It's like you're constantly being shown images of what people across various social divisions supposedly think. And so you're kind of constantly internalizing this sense of being isolated or alone. Um, so I don't know. I thought about all of that, and I thought about the poetry of Wakamatsu Jotaro,
Yes.
who's kind of lived his whole life in northeastern Japan. He lived in coastal Fukushima for a very long time in Minami Soma, and he has this one poem where was it? I can't remember the name of it, but he talks about this unsettling feeling of watching people playing in the waves near a nuclear power plant. And he asks, you know, what is it that I'm watching right now? And it, I don't know. So I think about that. Um,
That's such a stunningly prophetic poem,
yeah,
from decades before. I think he himself went to visit Chernobyl,
yeah,
right? And so he has that in mind, and watching people
yeah.
surf and play in the waves, and situating himself in terms of latitude and longitude,
Mhm.
and so spatially and then temporally. It's a very, very haunting poem.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm glad you brought him up. And he's been translated some into English, so that's maybe something we can share too
Yeah,
in the resources. Um, I don't I just found myself intimidated walking that coast. It is
yeah.
there several times I've been, it's always been windy.
Mhm.
And even if the sea is calm, hardly like that tsunami day, there's something
Mm.
forceful about it that makes you feel small. And
Yeah.
there was a beach house that's been preserved. And then when the camera turned back to the grassy land, that will all be developed as part of the Innovation Coast framework, the project inspired by one of North America's most radioactively contaminated places, Hanford. So we'll get back to that. But um, I think the fact that the grandmother who shot that video and Our Planet shared it with us maybe is a good place to turn to the thyroid cancer
Mm.
trial. And maybe that too, we can start with the March to the Courthouse video.
Yeah.
It's very short clip.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, so in the front line, ooh, yes, the applause. That small woman is the parent of a plaintiff. And I think all the others carrying the banner are attorneys, including two young women attorneys, which is great.
福
Okay,
島
that's good. That's the lead attorney, a former judge. Um, I want to say something about the lead attorney. There are some extraordinary heroes in the judiciary, so outnumbered. But the person we just saw briefly holding his microphone is the lead attorney in this thyroid cancer case. And he used to be a judge. And it's so, yes, Mr. Ido.
Mhm.
Mr. Ido retired. I think he had 8 or 11 more years left before mandatory retirement as a judge. And he decided, no, he wanted to do something else. He's the first person who ruled in favor of plaintiffs seeking an injunction. This was back in 2006, I believe, on the operation of the nuclear power plant,
Mhm.
actually on Noto Peninsula. And then, so he wants not to just be a judge, he wants to be an attorney. And really his retirement has been pretty much taken up with Fukushima. But
Mm.
modest, hard working attorney who lives in central Japan. So for him to make it to court in Fukushima is a big hike and an expense. And I just want to say thank you, Mr. Ito, for existing.
Mm. He's such a huge presence in like all of the like every trial you've just
Well,
seen.
yes,
Everywhere.
the children's trial that you've been quite closely involved with.
Mhm.
So that thyroid cancer trial, which was the case was filed in 2021. I guess I need to say at the outset that to prove what's called in legalese probability of causation between an illness and a nuclear source is extremely hard. It's meant to be, it's made to be hard. Starting well, there's a document I put in our resources written by the historian Kate Brown, an essay, I think it's from 1987, the year after Chernobyl, the incident she's referring to, Kate is referring to, where the Department of Justice summons a meeting of, I think, Energy Department officials, attorneys, and saying, the battle is moving into the courtroom because lots of people from around the world are waking up to wanting to sue for their nuclear harms. And it's up to you lawyers to make sure this doesn't get anywhere. The need to make sure that nuclear technology, and I do want to say atoms for peace and atoms for war, that they can continue. Lawyers and judges have to step up to the plate to make sure that this technology will go on unhampered. So there's a risk to starting this lawsuit, and the risk is that they won't win. Yeah, but why did they do? I mean, one of the pressures is statute of limitations, which was 10 years, right? So ready or not, now or never in a way. And the extraordinary thing is that they found 6 young people who were between the ages of 6 and 16 at the time of the disaster to become plaintiffs. Obviously, their families had to agree too. It's an extraordinary act of courage. And yes, because it's they are all we don't know their names. They are the court papers that are revealed have anonymized them. They're referred to by number, which is also a great price to pay, right? Because it's so important for the public to see who these people are who have had their lives so grievously altered. Many of you listening to us, watching us may say, but we're told that thyroid cancer is one of the best cancers to get. I challenge whether any cancer is something we want to feel glad about. And secondly, a very much understated fact is that pediatric and youth thyroid cancer seems to proceed at a much higher speed than cancers for adults, most cancers for adults. Many studies, a big one from Korea is often very deliberately misleadingly used to say, but thyroid cancer isn't so serious. So of the original 6 plaintiffs, now there's one more, 4 of them have had metastasis, in some cases to distal organs like the lungs. So there is nothing to feel relieved about necessarily because of the thyroid cancer diagnosis. I want to say something about the 7th plaintiff. This is something the attorneys and supporters were hoping for, is that by some young people willing to come forth to be plaintiffs, that other people would be willing to join them. And so far, only one has joined, the 7th one, who was inspired by the coverage that existed, not nearly enough, and decided to join as a plaintiff. And when she made her plaintiff statement and spoke in court, she did it without barriers. And she spoke to the judges, addressing them, each one by first and last name, and saying, you know, we are serving as plaintiffs anonymously, but each of us, like each of you, has a name. Can you see me? Here I am. And which was an extraordinary act. And since then, 2 other plaintiffs have appeared in person in court to give their statements. So there's something to be said about that. But let me show another image, like why the hurdle is so high for people to share their experience of having thyroid cancer. And okay, so this is from 2016, so 5 years before the suit was filed. And this was a huge event, in Japanese called coming out. In other words, the coming out of parents of the children of thyroid cancer. But as you can see, I was very surprised myself to see what form this took. The two fathers were in Fukushima, and the press were in Tokyo and communicating. And of course, we see only their torsos. And so they were referred to as the person in black and the person in white. And not only are we seeing only their torsos, but their voices were altered. So they were turned into these altered, not fully human, truncated beings to engage in this brave act of saying that they are the parents of children diagnosed with thyroid cancer.
Mm.
And yet it was such a very brave thing. Now, to give just a little context, and Tommy, please fill in if I don't get it. What's important here, one of the most painful aspects of the nuclear disaster in Fukushima is that, one, it immediately awakened the memories of the A-bombs. And as not well-informed people are, younger people are nowadays, what it awakened was, along with the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the fact that Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims or survivors, sufferers is the term I'm comfortable with, were discriminated against. You know, why? I mean, first of all, I mean, the ones who suffered from external radiation from the initial blast often were severely scarred. So there was a visible component inviting discrimination or seeming to justify it in the ways that people can be. And the other was DNA, worries about DNA damage. And so this was such a serious worry that even when in 1957, the first healthcare provisions for Hiroshima and Nagasaki sufferers were made, many people who were eligible to get this government assistance did not apply for it. The reason being that applying for it was giving proof that you are a hibakusha, an A-bomb sufferer, and that who knew what that would do to your children. And so many people decided they were going to hold out until their children were safely employed and married. I know now that even that's not enough time, hearing someone who would be third generation a year or two ago speaking about cousins who still didn't feel that enough time had passed for them to come out as Hiroshima and Nagasaki suffered. So anyway, the threat of discrimination, the threat of somehow being identified with Hiroshima and Nagasaki worked as a huge disciplinary tool. And it not only on the part of the government, but also of your kin and neighbors. And it discouraged many people, oftentimes women, mothers, from talking about their worries for their children's health, because to talk about worries about health injury was to suggest that something was wrong with Fukushima, right? And that it was going to reinforce consumer reluctance and to retard Fukushima recovery and progress. And so the parents of children with thyroid cancer, just anecdotes that I've heard by sympathetic physicians. I think many physicians are sympathetic, but they are not necessarily able to express that, because the head of the Japanese Thyroid Association is a prominent researcher and authority who has really put the lid on recognizing any kind of probability of causation between the Fukushima disaster and thyroid cancer. And so even though this man was extremely helpful to the Chernobyl children's thyroid cancer victims. He's played an entirely different role in Japan. So anyway, that is why it's hard for these parents to come out. And as modest, excuse me, as this coming out was, you can see what an important first step it was, because that let us get back to that moment that we just saw the video of. And this woman, the mother of one of the plaintiffs, there's a moment in the video, I didn't call attention to it, where you can see when applause arises from the onlookers. And you can see that she looks in that direction, and you know from her eyes that she's smiling behind her mask. So to go from that scene of fathers truncated and voices altered to this one, where people are marching to the courthouse and she's in the front line with that banner, is an indication of the courage of some, hoping that others will join, and the extraordinary devotion of supporters and the attorney's team. I should add that pediatric thyroid cancer has up to now has been considered rare, like 1 to 2 per million annually. But right now, I think the number that's given is 370 in the dozen years since Fukushima. So even the authorities who want to deny causation, a probability of causation, many of them now say, yes, there's a cluster, but it wasn't caused by Fukushima. And this is the pattern we see throughout the world over the past decades, since people started protesting their injuries and the deaths of loved ones, is to have medical science say, yes, we can see that you're not well, and we don't know what caused it, but it's not the fallout from the bombs or the Chernobyl accident or 3 Mile Island. So I find it a very paradoxical situation in which advanced medical science is helpless to apparently to help us understand why so many people have fallen ill. Yeah.
I feel like what you just walked us through in terms of the way that people have to kind of obscure parts of themselves and depersonalize themselves in order to be able to say, like, publicly, I either have been hurt, by radioactive fallout, or I've been impacted, or someone that I love has been impacted. I feel like it's all the more cruel in the context where there are some kind of prominent academics who are kind of associated with nuclear reconstruction in Japan, who have been arguing that to speak about Fukushima is to be, or to talk about your injuries in a politicized way is an act of discrimination. So it's not just that that people are being silenced, but then also that they're being, I don't know if criminalized is not, they're not legally being criminalized, but they're kind of being treated as the aggressors or as kind of immoral for speaking about their experiences or trying to connect it to like a broader social analysis. And then it just,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's like you show so clearly how that is how that's just such a violent discourse or narrative, and also how false it is, because you see the continuation of discrimination against people who have been affected by radioactive fallout, continuing within the shadow of this whole kind of silencing of it.
Yeah, and you said not legally, but in fact, one of those academics, you're talking about actually to raise the ante. The term rumor harm or rumor damage has been used as a weapon and as a tool for those who, it's not, if it's not safe to talk about real harm. This is often true for fisher people who have worked so hard to test and have very high standards, higher than government standards for themselves. If it's hard for people to speak about actual rather than rumor harm, now the ante has been raised so that talking about harm turns you into a purveyor or an aggressor. And it is appalling. It's appalling. And how that language has been adopted by people of authority in the government too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now it's really just like it's about the object of harm goes from being people to being you're harming industry or you're harming basically profits, and that's
yes, that's right. That's right. But you don't have to
yeah,
say that. You can just say harming reconstruction and recovery.
yeah,
Yeah. So that you're also harming your neighbors, your families, cousins who are successfully entering the workplace.
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think, yeah. I mean, I guess for me, also what you talked about with the children's thyroid cancer trial, um, and these questions about representation also connects to kind of representations of nuclear workers, both over time and in the present moment. So I wanted to share like some images of that. And so I think just as a preface, some background on nuclear work. So the nuclear industry, broadly, especially in Japan and South Korea and France, relies heavily on subcontractors. So 80 to 90% of the workforce are subcontractors, and collectively they are exposed to disproportional amounts of the total kind of radiation dose for the workforce as compared to people who are directly employed by power companies. And I guess one thing to know about outsourcing is that it is a method to create disposable labor forces who can absorb the violent consequences of an industry without there being any social consequences for that, because it obscures who is responsible for the harms that are done to workers while they're on the job. So along with restrictive border regimes, they also create conditions for a kind of gradient of exploitation that can go from labor brokerage to like outright trafficking, where companies can make a profit by taking a cut out of someone's wages or someone's hazard pay for recruiting them. And the reason why this is able to continue is because there are groups of people who are kind of excluded from participating in the formal economy in a lot of ways. Yeah. So kind of going off of that, I guess before I talk about this image, I had a graph. No, this one. Okay, yeah, of labor violations at Daiichi, which in Japan people call Ichif, a 1F, but anyways, we'll call it Daiichi. So they've ranged from around 40% to 60% since 2011. In 2011, there was an almost 80% rate of labor violations at Daiichi. And kind of some of the major things that are happening that just continue to remain normative in the industry are wage theft, overwork, and then safety violations. So not adequately telling workers what kind of work they're going to be doing or what kind of conditions they're going to be doing that work in, not giving them the proper safety equipment, not properly recording their exposures. And so this relates a lot to the story of Igari Tadaki-san, who I I actually never met him. I only learned of him after he had passed away. He died on site at Daiichi. He was a car mechanic, and his job was to repair vehicles, contaminated vehicles that had been on site since 2011. So um, these were contaminated vehicles, and because of that, even though he was working in an area of Daiichi that was relatively had low radiation levels, everyone in the shop had to wear this kind of full protective gear that you see in the photo on the right. Um, Igari-san is from Iwaki, which is a kind of the largest city to the south of the rest of coastal Fukushima, where the nuclear power plants are sited. It became like a huge center for nuclear workers to come through and to kind of commute from there to Daiichi in the early years of the cleanup. And as the evacuation zones have kind of been lifted in these kind of successive waves and this kind of spectacle of the performing, like, you know, we're recovering, this constant like performance of like recovery is happening and here's how you can see it happen because we can inhabit more space. As that's been happening, you've seen kind of temporary prefab buildings, which are dormitories for subcontractors, springing up kind of further and further north. So he was someone from Iwaki who kind of, there's been a lot of ways that I think that Iwaki's ties to the nuclear industry have, it seems like, kind of become stronger after 2011. I have to do more research onto kind of what it was before, but it seems to me like there's a lot of ways that people in this kind of southern part of the Fukushima coast got kind of pulled into the economy of cleanup and decontamination. And then there's been a lot of, we'll talk about with the Innovation Coast, ways that that has become formalized and institutionalized in new ways. So Tadaaki-san, you know, originally he was working he wanted to be a car mechanic. He was in kind of a vulnerable economic position because he had like quit his job a little while ago and was kind of in between, not necessarily in between things, but he wasn't necessarily working in the kind of career that he wanted. And so he was recruited by the head of the subcontracting company, which was a like car rental and car repair company, as a mechanic. And I don't think that it was immediately clear, like when, you know, his boss first talked to him, that he would be working at Daiichi. So what would happen is that he was spending kind of at first maybe 1 or 2 days a week going up to Daiichi and working there to repair these contaminated cars, and the rest of the week he would spend in Iwaki doing kind of uncontaminated work. And then over time, the amount of time he spent at Daiichi increased. Yeah. So the way that Tadaaki-san died is he collapsed. His heart failed when he was at Daiichi. He had just come back from his lunch break. And TEPCO, he had been complaining of kind of heart pain for days prior to that happening. And his family, like TEPCO at first, immediately kind of they had a scheduled press conference later that day already, but they included the news of his death in it. but they immediately said, insisted that it had nothing to do with the workplace. It had nothing to do with them. It was just, someone from perhaps a pre-existing condition or perhaps something else. I think they wouldn't comment on what exactly had taken place. This was before they had even allowed his family to come and confirm his death. So it was before his family had even seen his body that they kind of made this public announcement. And then there was a trial. His family refused to accept this. It was his wife and his sister-in-law who were just these amazing people who like refused to I don't know, they were like, this is not right, clearly something has happened, and they refused to accept the kind of obscuring of truth or these kind of like runaround that they were given by TEPCO and the subcontractor and the contracting company. So they did their own research. They spoke to the doctor that had examined his body, for the autopsy report. They spoke to his coworkers. They just talked. They reached out to the nuclear workers kind of support center, which had been started by local unions and the local Socialist Party. And through that process, they were able to find that he had been working. He would leave the house at maybe 3 or 4 a.m. and he wouldn't get home until I think it was like 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. So he would just come home and fall asleep at the couch so that he would have enough, energy to wake up the next day and go back to work. And this was like 6 days a week. So I wanted to share these two images of Tadaaki-san because I feel like they're kind of both images that we don't necessarily see of nuclear workers a lot. The one on the left is shared in a book written by the Tokyo Shimbun journalist Katayama Natsuko. She won a prestigious prize for her journalism. She's been just this amazing person who has continuously reported on the everyday lives, like the working conditions, but also the family lives and just, whatever that nuclear subcontractors are experiencing. She's been publishing a regular column on that for since 2011. And so she compiled kind of her columns into a book. And she includes this photo of Tadaaki-san. And it makes me think about kind of seeing nuclear workers in their full context. If you look at these two images together, you can really see the intensity of the boundary between Daiichi and the rest of Tadaki's life. He didn't tell his family that he was working at Daiichi for a long time. His sister-in-law didn't know until I think it was a few months before he passed away. And then you can also see kind of, I feel like how this subcontracting company, but also TEPCO exploited his dreams for his life. He really loved like repairing cars and repairing vehicles, and this was his pathway to being able to get back to doing that work that he found so fulfilling. And so to have that used as a way to kind of channel you or funnel you into decommissioning work or nuclear work, unfortunately, is a kind of common thread that has come up in historical accounts of nuclear workers in the 70s and the 80s in Japan as well. So part of this, I just wanted to say, I kind of appreciate the Katayama Natsuko's kind of attention to the everyday life of workers and trying to kind of fully situate everyone. The other thing, I guess, the photo on the right with him in all of his protective gear, this photo is taken from the Facebook page of the group that was, established to support his family and support the lawsuit. seeking compensation from TEPCO and the contractor and subcontractor for his death. It's a selfie that he took of himself when he was at work, which is technically not allowed. And I think this is also, on the one hand, there's this kind of depersonalizing effect of the protective gear or something. I think a lot of the times people can focus on the uniform, and that's kind of what defines you as a nuclear worker, as opposed to the stories of how you came to be in that position. But it's also this very like intimate and haunting image where he's looking at himself. And I think that there's a really, I don't know, there's just like a question that I feel like he leaves all of us with by doing that.
Yeah, thank you. The wonderful journalist that Tommy referred to has written one of the Fukushima books that I didn't want to have end. I mean, that's a very weird way to put it, but I never have felt so close to the lives. Yes, there we go. I hear she's coming up with a sequel this spring. I hope that happens, but it was very, very in precious time spent with workers that I would never meet or hear their stories in this way. And one kind of thing that struck me in it, which seems obvious but wasn't until I read it, is how for these workers, out of so-called regard for their health, they have a limit of cumulative exposure. And as the end of the year approaches, they're worried about their exposure levels and want to manipulate them. Why? Because what if the year end comes and you haven't been able to work for a while? Then how are you going to get presents, New Year's presents for your kids? And so this really excruciating calculus about how much more can I expose myself so that I'll have money to function as a proper husband and father.
Yeah.
So there's that logic. And as we all know, the measurements are extremely carelessly done and inaccurate. And yes, and it's not just workers. I had a friend who was working in a lab in Chicago, and his lab director asked him, not the University of Chicago, but in Illinois, and his lab director said, "What's that you've got around your neck?" And my friend said, "Oh, it's a film badge." And he says, "How do you expect to do decent science with something like that around your neck?" And forced him to take it off. So I think nuclear, the harms and the rewards are very unevenly distributed, but there's a great opportunity to exploit even the elite. And I wish the elite might be more cognizant and vocal about that.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. There was a really, I forget her name now. There was an amazing book written about nuclear workers, nuclear subcontractors in Japan by a scholar from Gifu University. I think her last name was Takahashi. But you can really see, I mean, if you read that along with the kind of photojournalistic accounts that were there was a lot of what is it, kind of journalistic novels that were written about nuclear workers in the 70s and the 80s. You can really see this huge breadth of like class positions within the nuclear industry, where you can have at the same time kind of unhoused workers who are recruited at the used to be, that they would mostly be recruited in person at these kind of gathering places called the Yoseba, in kind of neighborhoods that were designed for the purpose of kind of pooling their labor. and making it available and controllable by usually like violence of Yakuza groups, so crime syndicates. Um, and you could have those people being recruited, usually I think a lot of the time, to do kind of decontamination work within reactors or other kind of highly contaminated work. And then at the same time, you could have kind of middle class people from the region who have technical skills like welding or other kind of vocational skills that are, also kind of coming into nuclear work. And then, of course, there are like the engineers who are at the very top, or the plant managers, or people who have training as kind of radiation safety people. So there's this really huge variation in the experiences of nuclear like even within among nuclear subcontractors, that I think is really important to acknowledge, and not to have it become like one, I don't know, one stereotyped kind of image. This photo was taken by Higuchi Kenji, who is kind of well known as a photojournalist who documented the stories of a lot of nuclear workers. I think, yeah, starting in the 70s and 80s, he's still, very active now. And I just also wanted to kind of bring this photo in terms of thinking about like what you were just saying now, Norma, about this kind of the domestic impacts of nuclear work. And kind of considering that is also part of the context of the nuclear industry. Um, so this is a portrait of Murai Kunio-san, who was from Shiga Prefecture. He worked for a company that at the time was called Biru Daiko, which is now known as Atox. They are kind of infamous. They're a major nuclear subcontractor that has specialized in decontamination work inside of the reactors since pretty early on. I think they started out as a building cleaning company and then transferred very quickly over. I think that they started in the 50s as a building cleaning company. And then I think by the 60s or so, they had already kind of shifted straight into specializing in like nuclear cleanup work, which is relevant in the context of TEPCO in 2019 announced that they wanted to hire foreign specialized, what is this, SSWs, specialized skill workers. And one of the jobs that they, the job types where they said that they would be looking for within that would be people with experience cleaning, with building cleaning, which if you're reading that through a nuclear lens, that means that they're looking for someone to do decontamination work, the kind of most exposed work within the nuclear reactor. Thankfully, there was like immediate outcry, and the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare like sent them a notice, kind of telling them that they needed to like basically just discouraging them from that plan, so it wasn't implemented. But that's something to keep in mind in terms of like how cleaning companies like become like a weirdly integrated part of nuclear subcontracting. So he was doing this work cleaning up radioactive leaks or building scaffolding in highly radioactive parts of the reactor. He worked in Tsuruga nuclear power plant, which is operated by the Japanese Atomic Power Company, or Nippon Genden. And he became too sick to work. His hair was falling out in clumps. His teeth were falling out. He was experiencing pain all over his body. And so because of that, this is a photo of him at home with the caption reading that his wife's kind of piecework with her sewing is what is sustaining the family. And I feel like there's a lot that you can see here about like his positionality as, kind of feeling almost like separate within his own home. I just feel like there's a lot that is really evocative about this photo, that I wanted to highlight, in terms of this, like what you talked about, this negotiation between trying to be a good husband and father, and figuring out like what place does your own health play in that. Um, yeah, yeah. And then finally, I think just to kind of contrast, I had a photo, yeah, these photos of, this is how nuclear workers appear in the TEPCO decommissioning hall, which, let's see, I think which opened its doors in I think it was either 2018 or 2019. It was while I was in Fukushima. And then this is the photo, sorry, from the decommissioning hall. And it kind of starts with an apology, for the nuclear disaster, which kind of frames it in terms of their technological hubris, as opposed to, calculated indifference, to people's lives. And it ends with this section on, nuclear workers. I This was the first public relations facility that I saw, that was built, post 2011 in Fukushima Prefecture, that, dedicates any kind of, acknowledgement or, focus on nuclear workers. Um, which I mean, I don't know, but I think is probably related to kind of the bad, like the increasing, outrage over the treatment of nuclear workers, in decommissioning and decontamination work. And you can, I mean, here, I think just the thing that I notice is just the way that workers are identified in terms of their protective gear, or these photos that are, I guess, supposed to be kind of a montage of workers, but also are in some ways an image of kind of like work sites with kind of people who happen to be in them. So you really can't see like the personal or the social history of how or why workers end up at Daiichi. And there's this real emphasis on kind of performing a demystification of the nuclear workplace, but it's through like showing you these selective, like very concrete images that appear to be neutral, but they don't really tell you what they're obscuring or what they're, drawing attention away from. Yeah, so I was thinking about all of that.
It's exhausting just to see these images, isn't it? To imagine their lives and the, just how constrained and pressed and painful they are, and the work often for their families that, they in some cases don't want their children to know where they work, so the children don't get tainted by the association. And
Right.
however you cut it, it's unjust and painful. And yet containing, such as it is, the disaster is utterly dependent on them willing to become receptacles of radioactivity, as it were. That's not how we think about it, or we're asked to think about it. But we've both referred to the Innovation Coast framework, and maybe another site for wonderful, exploitation of workers, to more opportunities, and for the general public. Maybe I'll share my screen and yes, and go. Yeah, that's all right. Just to show you. So this is coastal Fukushima, right? The power plants were around here, and I think it's so insidious that this map doesn't even bother to mark the plants, as if we no longer have to worry about their presence, although they are not stabilized even as a physical structure, given earthquakes, hurricanes, wind and flooding, and the fact that things are not stopping, they're rusting, etc. So even though they're not secure, this map of the Fukushima Innovation Coast Framework doesn't, as I said, show them. Whoops. I just wanted to point out to you the things that they claim will happen along this coast. Work on nuclear decommissioning, that's a huge, huge, I want to say myth almost, because Fukushima Daiichi, there is no way really they're going to remove that core any predictable time. And yet that goal of decommissioning is used to justify so many other activities. Robots and drones, I'll say a word about that next. Energy, environment, and recycling, all of these wonderful things, and university study, education, development are scheduled to happen on the Innovation Coast. So keep that in mind. And the inspiration for that, I mentioned briefly, is Hanford, the plutonium facility in inland Washington State that I have now learned so many Washingtonians even don't know about. But there it is, and it produced the plutonium, of course, for the Nagasaki bomb, and continued to produce, what was it? There were 9 so-called production reactors for the Cold War, a very, very contaminated space. So here are some of what is called the tank farm, tanks that store all kinds of radioactive materials from the earliest days of this site working. So you can imagine just how hard to deal with it. And it has been, and it really has not been dealt with. This is the B reactor down below, which produced the Nagasaki plutonium. It's now available. I don't know if foreigners can go there, but US citizens of all ages can visit it, since the whole site is one of the Manhattan, what is it, the national park system, this and Los Alamos and Oak Ridge. And before, with a modicum of conscience, I think if you were under 14, you needed parental permission, but now there is rather encouragement for school children of Washington State to visit it. So there's that. And then here, the Pacific Northwest Laboratory. Here's something I learned only last year. There are 18 national labs in the United States, and 17 of them are run by the Department of Energy, which is to say they all have their origins in atomic weapons development in some way or other. You know, when you say national laboratory, you think, gee, you could study a lot of things in a national laboratory. And indeed, nuclear technology does open itself to various kinds of applications. And of course, they study climate science and so forth and so on. But it's very sobering to me to realize that 17 of the 18 national laboratories are under the direction of the Department of Energy. And the 18th one is the Cancer Institute, which also seems not accidental that, you know, you have all of these places dedicating themselves, having been involved with the production and transport and storage of nuclear materials. All right, maybe dedicate one institute to the study of cancer, which is, of course, one of the, if not the major thing that most of us are anxious about when we think about radiation exposure. And then I just wanted to put on the slide the Hanford Reach Museum, which is the museum component of this complex. When I visited, it was all about the Manhattan Project glory days and the dedicated labor and extraordinary scientific achievements that took place there. So Hanford, obviously the candidate, right, for Fukushima recovery. I could hardly believe it when I first learned about it. But there were approaches, I think, made as early as 2012 when a Japanese scientist working at Pacific Northwest National Labs was asked to come to Fukushima. He traveled back and forth many, many times. So even in 2012, just the following year, there was already a notion of taking this, the headquarters of bomb development and contamination as your model for recovery from a nuclear power plant site. And I thought that the fact that Hanford is the model for Fukushima recovery is another very economical sign of how you can't keep atoms for peace and atoms for war apart. They really are joined at the hip, and they go on facilitating each other materially and intellectually and through labor force. So let's see. This would be, I think, the model, what a very grand Fukushima Japanese version of the Pacific Northwest lamps might be. A rather modest structure at the moment, but it is the planning headquarters of the Fukushima Institute for Research, Education, and Innovation, called FRAE. And if you were to go to their website, of course, they have everything in English too. You can see the visions planned for it. It's going to have world-class everything. And it's going to be the brain center for the innovation coast and for all the different activities there. And I particularly wanted to put out the robot test field. Still looks, grassy and isolated, but it's dedicated to robots and drones. And I was very intrigued to just learn that in a 2016 document circulated at a preparatory study group for the Fukushima Institute for Research, Education, and Innovation, it was stated that the robot test field was going to be CBRN response capable. CBRN is an acronym, I think, known the world over for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. We know that Japan still has Article 9, the no war clause, in its constitution, as much as it's been chipped away with. As much as it's been chipped away with, I want to say it's still worth hanging on to. And one of the ways I argue that is that when something has been so decimated by being explained away, by having laws and acts passed that make it toothless, and yet it is worthwhile for the government to try to get rid of it, there has to be something very precious that the rest of us have to cling to. So Article 9 is supposed to have set up a firewall between Japan and war capability, but guess what? No crisis should not be taken advantage of. And the Fukushima nuclear crisis seems to offer a very new kind of opportunity for Japan's militarization effort in a way that hadn't previously been offered. So this CBRN capable, it may not show up in more subsequent documents. They may have wised up, but you can see that its relative isolation is also an advantage. I wonder if you'll show your Ripurun.
Oh, the video?
Yeah, just another
Yeah.
kind of facility that's part of. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, this is a site that was a facility that was built to educate the public about the interim storage facility, which is basically a landfill project in Tomioka town. All of the nuclear waste that had been created from decontamination and efforts was being, at the time, transported from across the prefecture by truck into these containers that each had, as they explained to you at this facility, that each have their own GPS chip so that you can keep track in real time of where exactly each specific container is going and when it ends up in this landfill. And this kind of state-of-the-art public relations or public education facility was created in Tomioka town, right next to the landfill site, to educate people about it. And you can see it has this really, there's this kind of eco-friendly, like approachable aesthetic that has been used in a lot of the reconstruction public relations facilities. And like in the same way as with the decommissioning hall, but I think even to a greater extent, there's an emphasis on kind of see for yourself, learn for yourself, experience for yourself. But you're experiencing these very like curated um, ways of engaging with the spaces. I think I wish that I had taken a photo of it, but it seems like I didn't. I think there was actually also a live monitor feed so that you could actually
Yes.
watch nuclear workers who are at the landfill site, you know, working in real time. So it's kind of this idea of transparency of like, you know, see for yourself how safely all of this work is progressing, and you can just watch all of it happen in real time, and that is kind of the guarantee of safety, in addition to this kind of technological things like, oh, we have these GPS trackers so we know where every waste container is.
I think though, it took me a lot of last night to clarify that this is not the intermediate, but the permanent landfill
All
site,
right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
right? And the reason that's so striking is that the government promised Fukushima people in 2011 that the waste generated here was going to leave the prefecture in 30 years, so 2044. And so that is so voluminous that they're doing everything to try to reduce the volume. And through all this processing, they are assuring us that waste between 8,000 and I think 100,000 becquerels per kilo, I have to check the upper limit, will be here permanently. And I think this, you know, see for yourself and touch and play, that's a great word, right? For this facility is really to get Fukushima people to be comfortable with living with so much waste, with technology that, well, technology of this sort is we don't know. I mean, it's how is it going to withstand hurricanes or earthquakes, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing is, Tommy talked about, all of you probably have seen those big plastic garbage bags into which soil scraped off and yard waste was piled up. So that was all nuclear labor that entailed exposure. And then it was moved. I mean, all of that transfer and storage is also nuclear labor. And then in order to transfer, to assess and transfer them, either to the intermediate landfill site, which has the highest concentrations, the highest, most contaminated things, to send them either there or to this landfill site, is also nuclear labor. But what it meant was unpacking those garbage bags and removing, I think by hand, what was inside to repack them in other containers. It's appalling and ludicrous and appalling. But the other thing I'm thinking is with the Hanford model, the Hanford inspiration is to have a nuclear disaster and to have it take place in a wealthy country like Japan or the United States, is if you play it right, it means having access to endless funds, to endless budget, because we don't know how to get rid of, or we don't know how to tame this waste, and we don't know safe ways of containing it. And it will keep leaking out, as has happened in Hanford, and gone home with workers too, different things collapsing with the old storage technology, and has happened also in Fukushima. Because these projects are so daunting scientifically and don't pose a ready solution, it's an invitation to more budgeting, right? And so when you watch these things and how the projects proceed, you come to see that a nuclear disaster in a wealthy country is a gift that keeps on giving. It's a horrifying thing. Decommissioning in Fukushima, I mean, TEPCO itself says 40, it used to say 40 years. I don't know if they still try to say that. It's not going to happen in 40 years. And the terrible part of this gift that keeps on giving is that, yes, there are people who live with this, who will depend on it for their livelihood. And so it's a terrible boondoggle, and a terrible trap.
The work that you pointed us towards, that, what was it, the reporting that was done by Wada Nakako-san on this issue, she talked about how essentially there's a lobby that was formed, Tridec, that was formed in Hanford, of all of the companies that kind of benefited from this decontamination economy. And they're kind of part of the model in Fukushima, and this F-ray project is to create a Tridec, similar kind of association that they talk about the need to centralize and coordinate between education or knowledge, the research, the state, and then industry, right? So there's this kind of like, it's like an import, it's like, let's use the military industrial complex to see how much that we can make off of exploiting people, you know, where the people doing the actual work are experiencing routine wage theft, and like low wages for the labor and the hazards that they're kind of being exposed to, that are like siphoned off. The profits are siphoned off from them through all of these layers of subcontracting. And then it's happening through this like labor system that the subcontracting allows for the absorption of wages, you know, upwards through the contracting chain, and the kind of cutting off of people socially or politically, which I think is like important because there's so many different ways that you could organize work, and the need for this kind of some kind of sacrifice or some kind of life of exposure. There's so many different ways that you could organize that, but this way is a way of doing it that is just concentrating wealth at the kind of top levels of government and research and industry.
Yeah. I just want to underscore what you just said, that there are other ways of organizing this kind of work. And I think that's important. As it's a painful acknowledgement to make that we can't ever free ourselves from these radionuclides completely. We can't, they're in most of our bodies, depending on where we live, but yeah, it's pretty hard to imagine any of us is completely free. But and something does have to be done with these stores. And yet there has been no priority other than maximizing profit for those at the top and doing it cheaply for those at the bottom, and figuring out ways to present it, stories to tell, that make it not palatable for the people who have to, on whom the greatest burdens are imposed. But if I was looking at in Hanford at the courses offered at the community college level, and there it's a lot about management of radioactive waste and whatnot, which is not what scientists at Pacific National Laboratory are doing. You know, they're not the ones who have to be exposed and worrying about their labor immediately with the tank farms and other forms of storage. So that hierarchy goes on and on.
I guess
Maybe I just show the The dream school?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. The dream school.
Yeah, the
Yes,
dream school is a
let's,
really good example of that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so I showed, we looked at, yes, this is housing, first of all. Let me see, maybe there's, go, this is housing that's being built up in what used to be, what do we call it, no-go zone or exclusion zone in Okuma town, which was one of the towns hosting Fukushima Daiichi. And now these quite comfortable looking structures have gone up to woo people to return. There again, you have a carrot and the stick. Some people were supported in evacuation, but of course, this is one of the big issues of the Fukushima disaster is those narrowly drawn concentric circles, which the fallout did not observe. And the fact that they were so narrow and people outside, I mean, even within the 20 to 30 kilometer zone were not supported in leaving. And then and this was also a great source of those women who were made to seem deviant because they were leaving on their own instead of having been accordance with government instruction. But you can try to do something, control evacuation by withdrawing support and then also opening up what had been restricted, ready or not, right? The Olympics helped a lot in reopening closed zones. And you build this kind of housing in Okuma town. It still has a very eerie feel of stark underpopulation. Not everyone has come back. I've heard that anecdotally that they're hoping single mothers might come back or people from outside the prefecture, not terribly informed about what the progress of this area, because they're going to offer incredible services. And on the upper, whoops, sorry. This is on the upper left hand is the town hall, which is really magnificent. It is this most splendid town hall I've ever been in Japan, I think. And on the right is the interior. It's full of wood because, as you know, Fukushima is a heavily wooded place. The huge lawn is kept very trim by a robot. And it's just spacious, just a very spacious place. And going along with this kind of public facility is the public school, which I show in here on this upper left, lower left. It's finally, it opened last year. And this is an interior view of the space. It's not like any Japanese public school I know of, or most private schools even. I waver on how to translate it, but right now I'm calling it the Forest of Dreams Schoolhouse. I might call it House of Learning, the Forest of Dreams. It's for ages 0 to 15, so it's going to be providing daycare and preschool care, and then continuous education, so you don't have to take an entrance exam into middle school. It's going to value the individual, no preset schedule for each day. I've heard that even first and second graders could determine their schedules for the day. It's, and very open to the community. So a lot of interaction with seniors in the community. It's like your dream community building. Cost a huge sum of money. I think it has about 30 students right now. So these are the most luxuriously treated school children in Japan, if you want to look at it as a budgetary matter. It is the school, the version of the public school that had evacuated to the western part of the prefecture. Not all parents were happy that the school was moving back and reopening in this glorious form. not all parents were seduced by the wonderfully innovative curriculum that was promised because they said, no, we're not ready to think that it's safe. And in fact, what is it called? The Mother's Radiation Lab, uh, Citizens Lab, emphasizing
Tarantino or
Tarachine. Yep,
yeah.
Tarachine.
Mhm.
Yeah, in English, you could look it up as Mother's Radiation Lab. We'll put it in the resources. Um, they did um, they did soil sampling before it opened and found very high levels just in the wooded areas outside. Do we assume that that doesn't migrate inside? Do we assume the kids don't pick up dirt on their way home from school or to or whatever? Um, it is in that coastal area and in the town that hosted the reactors. The other town that hosted it, this is all part of the F-Ray Innovation Coast vision, is promising that it's going to open an international school. It's sort of like one-upping the Forest of Dreams,
Mm,
international, because they're hoping that
mm,
F-Ray, the research wing of it, is going to attract researchers from around the world, and that they will, because foreigners often do, bring their families, and who will want a, a, a an appropriately august high-level school for their kids. So an international school beckons Fukushima parents, I suppose, with the thought that their kids will be getting an immersion program in English from preschool, and that they could be hobnobbing with the children of international researchers.
mm,
All kinds of dreams being set in place in these recently reopened, but still depopulated areas. Um, I want to say also that the moms who haven't come back, um, in a very moving way, have tried to stay in touch with their former neighbors who have moved back, and tried to have R&R days. Overnight might be asking too much, and so that their kids could come back and enjoy snow play in Western Fukushima, and just to stay in touch to find out for themselves what's really going on in this
mm,
new environment. And for and they have, yes, I have heard from them that some of the parents who moved are actually regretting their move,
mm,
seeing what it is, because in part, this new, it may well be, and I need to look into it much more myself, this laissez-faire education, let the child determine what they want to learn, could also be seen as part of the personal responsibility of neoliberalism. And, um, depending on how many teachers they're able to recruit for this school, well, it might actually be convenient to have the kids be in charge of their own education.
mm,
I think the ideas that were put out are extremely appealing, but how they might work out in this place, I think still very much remains to be seen.
mm,
Yeah.
mm. And it really follows. I mean, even the competition between Futaba and Okuma was something that people had talked about as something that really started with the nuclear industry, kind of presence or moving into the region,
Yeah.
um, as well as this is only something that I heard like anecdotally, so I'm not, I haven't looked into it as much as I would like, but um, I remember there was also, what was it? Okuma was known for being a place where it was easier to raise children on your own if you were like a single mother. So there was always this kind of plutopia thing of like
Mm.
providing the fuller services of the state that you would want to have, these kind of full conditions of social citizenship that you would want to have in any environment, but only provided on the condition of, live next to this nuclear facility.
Yeah.
Yeah. And be
Yeah.
silent about exposure or health.
You had the nice quote from the from Martin Luther King
Yeah.
in Tondi book. And
Yeah.
because the war in Ukraine so activated for many of us in the world, but it seems like the world is no longer interested, and
Mhm.
how terrifying it is to have a nuclear power plant in a war zone.
Mhm.
Um, it just happened last week, right? That again, the last lines to external sources of power were cut off at the Zaporizhia plant, but I'm not reading about it in most places.
Yeah.
But the ways in which the sense we started out with about uh, the global nature of it, the colonial imperial history of it, the uneven
Mhm.
distribution of harm and benefit,
Mhm.
and the fact that that atoms for peace and atoms for war are never far apart at all. In fact, they are identical. But
Yeah.
I thought coming across that Martin Luther King quote you put up
Yeah.
from 1958 seems so
Yeah.
timely.
Yeah. I think ending with that is a good place. Um, yeah, so this was a quote again from the Vincent Intondi book, African Americans Against the Bomb. It was from a speech that he gave at the War Resisters League in 1959. And he says, what will be the ultimate value of having established social justice in a context where all people, Negro and white, are merely free to face destruction by strontium 90 or atomic war? And I think for me, it brings up, like you said, the the threat of nuclear war that feels very present, not only because of what's happening in Ukraine, but then also because of the way that NATO has been, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, NATO has been talking about the possibility of limited nuclear war. The European Union and the UK have kind of categorized nuclear energy as a sustainable energy. The Inflation Reduction Act in the United States kind of created incentives for increased investment in nuclear power. So you could just see atoms for peace and atoms for war just like happening together right now. Um, and there was part of, I think, Vincent and Tondi's argument was about how like colonialism and imperialism have taken this nuclear form, and like what we have to think about that really seriously if we're thinking about decolonization. um and I think just like keeping the kind of anti-colonial frame that Martin Luther King kind of came to in his analysis of nuclear war, along with other kind of people from the civil rights movement, as well as Pan-Africanists at the time, I think really complements the analyses of nuclear colonialism that have come out of the Pacific and that have come out of Navajo Nation, Western Shoshone Nation, in the Turtle Island context, as well as so many other places. Um, and I guess, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, maybe just best to end there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess maybe one word about, because there are lots and lots and lots of sincere people who believe that nuclear power is necessary to address climate change.
Oh,
But
right.
right. And so
Right.
I think we want to say, we'll put up a number of sources, but it can't be done. Even supposing that you could get rid of the harms, which I hope you're at least willing to entertain the idea that they cannot be gotten rid of. And so I think there's a very strong moral objection to this technology, that there can't be enough nuclear power plants built fast enough to address this. And they are also at risk because of climate change and
Mhm.
flooding and loss of enough cooling water because rivers gotten overheated. So it's not an answer, along with its being deadly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that the same things that Tommy, just the same considerations that Tommy brought
Yeah.
to the Martin Luther King statement apply to nuclear power too.
But it reminded me of a quote from the protest against the nuclear wastewater dumping in Fiji by Elaine Chandra, the Justice Pacific head of Justice Pacific. And she said, "We're already fighting for access to clean water and food, and now we have to fight this nuclear radiation. Decision makers of the day are not thinking about the future or the children." And I feel like that also just highlights the like, if you look at what people who are who are most heavily impacted by the intersections of climate justice and nuclear justice, they're not calling for nuclear power. They're calling for, you know, a nuclear free and independent Pacific, uh, because it endangers like the environment in the same ways and their health in the same way.
Yeah, but I can't add another, help adding another footnote, which is that because it's another of of our themes, is that March 4th is the first date of the injunction trial. So that everyone, all those people in Fukushima who were, and other parts of Japan who were protesting this nuclear wastewater dump, decided just because it began doesn't mean that we have to stop and that we should try to get an injunction. So many of the same attorneys, again, and many of the same activists have yet again arisen to make common cause also with the Pacific Islanders and say, no, we cannot tolerate the continuation of this. And if it's going to go on for decades, we also have time to try to stop it through the legal process.
Thank you, Norma.
Thank you so much, Tommy.